Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Charleston virtual session on collaborating for accessibility, how to create inclusive user experiences across organizational boundaries. I'm Emily Singley, Vice President of North American Library Relations at Elsevier, and I'm delighted to be here with Anita Foster, who's the Electronic Resources Officer at The Ohio State University, and Bill Kasdorf, Principal of Kasdorf and Associates. We're going to be sharing 3 different perspectives of collaboration around making digital resources more accessible. Anita is going to kick us off, talking about some of the work libraries do around accessibility. I'm going to be discussing accessibility from the perspective of a large publisher, and Bill's going to round us off with some updates on projects he's been working on as a technology consultant. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Anita to get us started.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Anita Foster. As mentioned, I'm the Electronic Resources Officer at the Ohio State University Libraries. I'm also a member of the Big Ten Library Accessibility Group and a former member of the Library Accessibility Alliance, as well as a participant in the Frame Emma project that you'll learn more about from Bill. Next. So I will start by saying I'm not a lawyer. We'll be discussing things that are impacted by laws and regulations. So the information in this session is based on my experiences working with accessibility and through other opportunities. It is not deemed to be legal advice in any way. Next. The World Health Organization estimates that approximately 16% of the world's population currently experience some sort of disability. They can be permanent or temporary and are grouped into one of 4 very general areas: physical, oral or hearing, vision, and neurological. We'll be talking primarily about digital or web accessibility, so I'd like to start with a couple of framing definitions to help center the discussion. These definitions are from the accessibility site, section 508.gov. First, accessibility is about more than compliance with standards. It's about developing solutions to meet the needs of all users with and without disabilities. Often universal design is a topic within web accessibility, and that's a concept in which products and environments are designed to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. In both of these definitions, you'll notice that users are centered within those definitions, regardless of ability, needs, or experiences. Next. So why are libraries concerned about support for accessibility and accessible online resources and tools to enhance the usability for people with disabilities? First, it's one of the central tenets of the profession. Libraries of all types focus on providing access, whatever the need is, for their constituents, whether at a public library, university library, or information center serving a specific population. ALA discusses this idea in their services to people with disabilities and interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. Many libraries include accessibility support in their mission, vision, and value statements, or in equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. At Ohio State, we have these in both areas. More and more institutions are creating and implementing digital accessibility policies with specific expectations for minimum compliance with federal, state, and local laws. For example, at The Ohio State University, any online platform resource or content either locally created or purchased from a vendor is expected to meet or exceed minimum digital accessibility standards. At Ohio State, the policy currently designates those minimum standards as the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short, at level 2.1 standards. WCAG 2.2 was released at the beginning of October, and those guidelines should shift in the future. And finally, sometimes institutions are complying with lawsuits or agreements with the Office of Civil Rights following complaints. For example, a well-known one is the Payan versus the Los Angeles Community College District. That suit included library resources and lack of accessibility. Next. There's a lot of additionally, legislation has support for persons with disabilities. The legislation listed here is specific to the United States, but many countries have similar legislation. There are many laws addressing support for people with disabilities, too many to go into detail today. I've linked to a page on the history of disability legislation provided by the U.S. Department of Labor. Two foundational laws I do want to call out are the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Both pieces of legislation predate the internet. To address the gap, there's currently a proposed rule recently open for comment. The comment closed in October, addressing Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, named as non-discrimination on the basis of disability, accessibility, and web information and services of state and local government entities. The rule directly addressed requirements for online resources and websites. Next. Additionally, updating legislation takes time, and occasionally offices release Dear Colleague letters to disseminate information and provide interpretation. In May, the U.S. Office of Civil Rights posted a Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Justice and the Education Department with direct and immediate impacts on higher education. It directly addressed the responsibilities of higher education institutions to ensure online resources and content are fully accessible. And it applies to education institutions at all levels, K through 12 and higher education, as well as public and private institutions. At Ohio State, this Dear Colleague letter has fast-tracked work already happening with expected compliance of all locally created institutional websites and content by summer 2025. Next. So what else are libraries doing to help support accessibility? Next. Let's see. I and multiple members of my team are heavily involved in supporting the requirements of the university's digital accessibility policy. But today I'm going to talk about a couple of larger initiatives that are having influence and impacts on accessibility of electronic resources used by all of our communities. First up is the Big Ten Academic Association Library Accessibility Group. It was formed in 2016 from the idea that all member libraries were facing similar issues around accessibility for the resources that many of us had and held in common, and that as a group, we might have more impact than single libraries working on their own. The group had two major outcomes: the development of model license language about accessibility that anyone can use. It's publicly posted. There are two versions, one for US-based vendors and another for international vendors. This was done to accommodate the differences in laws in many countries. The other outcome was the development of a platform testing evaluation program. The group engaged professional companies to complete high-level accessibility reviews, recognizing that a lot of issues that make sites difficult to use can be identified fairly quickly. Results of the evaluation are posted to a public website, and vendors are given the opportunity to respond to the results by explaining how they plan to address the issues. Next. In 2019, the Library Accessibility Alliance was formed. It grew out of interest in other organizations similar to the Big Ten doing similar work around accessibility support. The original members were the Big Ten Academic Association and the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries. Since its founding, additional consortia joined, and there are now 7 consortia involved in the Library Accessibility Alliance. Next. So what does the Library Accessibility Alliance do? Well, it consists of 2 committees: a steering committee that takes care of the governance of the group, and then action committees that are doing the work of the group. There are 5 action committee subgroups. The Training and Professional Development subgroup plans the webinar series and organizes training opportunities for LAA members. Communication and Outreach Committee publicizes the work of the Library Accessibility Alliances, develops documentation for presenters, and speaks to those interested in discussing LAA's work. The Impact and Analysis Committee conducts surveys, compiles data, and create reports to document the impact of the LAA. The Vendor Relations subgroup is newest, but it will be working with vendors that LAA evaluates to increase engagement and find opportunities to share accessibility best practices. Next. And then the final subgroup is the Electronic Resource Testing subgroup. So this is the same program that the Big Ten developed, but it's moved to the Library Accessibility Alliance. And as of the middle of October, over 109 platforms have been tested, including some re-reviews, because these tests do go back to 2017. Next. Then finally, how can vendors help libraries support accessibility on their campus? First and foremost, create born accessible platforms and content. If that's not possible, make VPATs, voluntary product accessibility templates, or similar documentation easy to find, make it complete, and make it current. And finally, reduce barriers for libraries working within institutional policies. Provide for extended trials that allow for accessibility evaluations. And then also, please work on improving license language. Feel free to use the Big Ten model language. It's a great place to start. But not having any language in your license can lengthen the time it takes to put new resources in place. So with that, we're going to transition over to Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. That was really informative, and it's nice to learn about the Dear Colleague letter. I hadn't seen that before, so that's wonderful to know about. And you queued me up perfectly. That's a perfect segue, because I am going to talk from the vendor perspective about some of the ways Elsevier works on accessibility. So I'm a former academic librarian, excuse me, and I came to Elsevier about a year ago. And in the past few months, I've had the opportunity to work closely with our accessibility team. Next slide, please. And I want to give a quick shout out to that team. Here's some of their names here, because I'm sharing some of the content that we put together for a 1 hour long webinar on how Elsevier works on accessibility. So I'm just going to hit the highlights today at this session, but you can access the recording here if you want to get more information. Next slide, please. So accessibility work is a very humbling experience. There's always more to learn. The work is always changing, and it never ends. So continuous improvement, working on it all the time is what's really important. You just have to keep plugging away at it. And the way that the work is done often changes and evolves over the years. Next slide, please. So at Elsevier, our team has been working on accessibility for our flagship ScienceDirect platform for over 20 years now. And in the early days of that work, the team was very heavily focused on becoming fully compliant with standards, such as the ones that Anita mentioned, and trying to get to a high VPAT score. And that was work that really involved a lot of checklists, going through the standards item by item, and remediation of the ScienceDirect interface to come into compliance. Next slide. But more recently, as we've made really good progress on the compliance and standards front, we've been able to increasingly turn our focus to accessibility user testing and carrying out that kind of dedicated testing. We've been able to start thinking more about who are we doing this for, not just checking a box or conforming to a list of items, but really putting users back at the center of this work and putting our energy into user tests, interviews, focus groups, et cetera, in an effort to find out what real people really need. Next, please. So we have been collaborating with users of many differing abilities, and that's really key to being able to do this for all types of users. And here I'm showing a picture of our accessibility manager, Ted Gies, testing with a low vision user at Wright State University. So not only does this kind of testing ensure that we maintain a user-focused approach, but it helps us dispel incorrect assumptions. So we may go into a test thinking, oh yes, this is what we think users really want or need, only to find out in our testing that they don't find it useful at all. So that's always helpful. But perhaps most importantly, testing with real users provides motivation for our developers. When you can go to a development team with not just a checklist, but also user-tested reasons and actual human stories of why we need a change done, they understand the work better and are more motivated to get it done, and things move up the queue pretty quickly. So recruiting users for testing can always be a challenge, and we're always seeking out people who may be interested. So as librarians who work with users every day, we're, if you know of people who might be interested in getting involved, we're always interested in collaborating with you. And one collaboration we've been doing recently was with the University of Regina in Canada, where we have regularly scheduled walkthroughs with a blind user every 2 weeks to test our SciVal product. SciVal is a relatively new interface for us, and we're working on making it fully accessible. Next. So community is absolutely essential to doing accessibility work. We cannot do it alone. And Anita certainly touched on some communities that we've partnered with in the past as well. This is a picture showing 8 people standing outside in front of some palm trees. And the man in blue is Ted Gies, our accessibility manager again. This was taken at this year's CSUN Assistive Technology Conference in Anaheim. And the group of folks he's with are all people we've collaborated with, accessibility librarians, vendors, other vendors who work on accessibility and so forth. So we've had successful partnerships with consortia and academic institutions over the years to work on accessibility issues together. And I have a list of some of those institutions here. Next, please. I also want to mention that in addition to collaborating with libraries and universities, there are often ways that vendors can collaborate with one another. And a recent vendor collaboration we've had was around making scientific charts and graphs more accessible. Charts and graphs have long been a challenge for visually impaired users, and web developers have attempted to solve the problem by providing chart data in a separate table view that a screen reader can pick up. But this requires a user to switch to an alternate view that interrupts their reading flow. So this collaborative partnership we've done with this company, HiCharts, which is a Norwegian company, is developing charts that are born accessible. The goal is to have just one chart that works well for everyone. And together we've come up with a new system of descriptive tags for charts and graphs that's beginning to set a new industry standard, and we hope will spread to other platforms. Next, please. So we know, as I mentioned, there's always more work to do on accessibility. It is never ending, but at the same time, it's really nice to see when our efforts pay off and are recognized. So I'm very proud to share that this year Science Direct was ranked #1 of the top 1 million websites in the WebAIM 2023 Wave Accessibility Rankings. Next, please. So we've come a long ways in the last 20 years, but there's always more to do. And one example of additional work is the need to continue to remediate older journal article content. The most accessible reading experience online is if content is presented in HTML format, and most of our content is in that format already. But we still do have some older articles on Science Direct that may only have the abstract or references in HTML, where the body of the article is still just in PDF. But bit by bit, we're working through this older content, again, to remediate and make them more accessible. So it's a mountain of work, but we will eventually get through it all. Next. And I want to close by, again, encouraging all of you to get involved with publishers and other vendors in accessibility work. And this echoes a little bit what Anita was talking about as well. So be sure to evaluate products for accessibility as you're considering them for purchase. Take advantage of those resources that are that the Library Accessibility Alliance has put out there. And request accessibility policies and VPATs from vendors as you're working with them. You can add accessibility language to RFPs or other procurement policies. And the fact that you're asking about accessibility during the procurement process is a powerful way to message to vendors that this really matters to you and your institution. And of course, as I mentioned before, please volunteer for user testing, focus groups, interviews. We are always looking for testers, regardless of ability, and we love testing with librarians. Next, please. And this is my final slide with just some links to Elsevier's accessibility resources and also the email that we use for any sort of accessibility inquiries. And this looks very kind of informal. I mean, it looks very formal, but actually our accessibility manager checks this email every day. So please feel free to reach out in that way. And with that, I will hand it off to Bill.
Thanks very much, Emily. And hi, everybody. I'm Bill Kasdorf. I'm a publishing technology consultant. I work mainly in the areas of content modeling, standards, editorial and production workflows, et cetera. And of course, all of that involves accessibility. And in fact, I often do work that's just accessible, testing publishers' websites and books and journals for being accessible and telling them how they need to improve them. And one of my consulting engagements that I've very much enjoyed for the past 4 years is in an project, a Mellon-funded project called FRAME, which is a collaboration between libraries, repositories, technologists, and disability services offices. Before I get into the details, I want to make 2 fundamental points about accessibility that are often overlooked. The first one is that accessibility is not binary. It's not that something is either accessible or it's not accessible. The issue is accessible for whom, with what kind of disability. And when you look at it from that point of view, a very small minority of the resources that are typically on college syllabi are actually accessible to every student that needs to access them. Some need them accessible in one way, some need them in a different way. And so there are what are called disability services offices, we refer to them as DSOs, that their job at the institution is to basically fix them, like providing image descriptions that aren't there for a blind student, or making something HTML or EPUB for a dyslexic student, etc. And what has been the practice for many, many years is that most of those DSOs have mistakenly thought that they could not share the results. Sometimes that's actually true because they've obtained the resources they've remediated or fixed from the publisher, and sometimes the publisher makes them agree not to give that remediated resource to anybody except that one student. So that's a contractual obligation, but it is not a legal obligation. One of the things that we first did on this in establishing this frame was to look at the legal background, the Marrakesh Treaty being a very important one globally. And basically, accessibility is what's called a copyright exemption, that for an individual that cannot consume a piece of content, whether a book or a journal article or whatever, making that accessible for them and giving them that copy without DRM is in fact permissible. So what the frame was set up to do is to create a system and a repository for remediated content to facilitate sharing of these things. And it's one reason that I was so committed to this project is that it's just shocking, and it's horrifying is a better term, to think of all the educational resources. Think of a book that's on curricula in 100 different universities. 100 different DSOs are remediating a damn thing. And that's just an incredible waste of time and waste of work. And those DSOs are overworked and to begin with. So this is actually, this was started by a friend of mine, John Unsworth at the University of Virginia, got a Mellon grant. He had previous an IMLS grant to kind of get the lay of the land. And then that fed into a Mellon grant for establishing this organization called Federated Repositories of Accessible Materials for Higher Education. And as I mentioned earlier, it involves libraries, repositories, and the DSOs and the university presses that are at those universities, and then creating a repository to provide federated access to all those resources, including metadata about them, so that a DSO that needed to get a particular resource for a particular student could search across all of these resources to find the resource that was available to them and remediated the way that student needed to have it remediated. Also, for them, after they did their work of remediating that thing for that student, they could deposit that remediated version back into Emma, or what is now called Emma, which is the repository, so that in the future, some other DSO can find that and say, oh, I don't have to do that remediation. This other DSO has already got it remediated. I've got what I need. One other reason that this is such a problem is that often these remediated resources take time to fix. And so that student is disadvantaged, sometimes weeks behind the other students in the class, because they just weren't able to get their content in time. So the libraries and DSOs all came in pairs, both from each pair from the same university. It was George Mason, Illinois, Northern Arizona, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Vanderbilt, University of Virginia, and University of Wisconsin, and Ohio State joined later in the game. So that's where Anita became involved. Oh no, I've got Ohio State on there. She was involved from the beginning. Sorry for that mistake. And then the repositories in the pilot phase were Benetech's Bookshare, which is specifically book oriented. I'll get back to why that's significant later. HathiTrust, which many of you in the library world will know what that is. It's a giant repository of content that originated with the Google Books project, and it's many universities are members of the HathiTrust. That's also relevant. The Internet Archive, which I know you're all familiar with. Another one that was a late addition, this is what I was thinking of rather than Ohio State, sorry Anita, was ACE, which is the Accessible Content Repository at the Ontario Council of University Libraries. They came in the last year of the project. And then there is now a fifth repository, which is the repository that we created to hold all this content, which is Educational Materials Made Accessible, conveniently known as, or affectionately known as Emma, I will say, and that's at the University of Virginia. So Emma is, on the one hand, it's the technical infrastructure developed in collaboration with both libraries and DSOs. So again, this is why we're part of this collaboration session here at Charleston. It unites all 5 repositories, so it's millions of resources, and enables searching across all of them with one unified search. And one thing that was interesting about this in the first place was that the developers that first started to work on it, and this is true of Bookshare as well, is that they were assuming, using what technically is called Elasticsearch to look for books by this author or books on this subject, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, that's not what a DSO needs. They're looking for a particular book, not just the particular book, but a particular edition of a particular book. So it's a known item search. So that, that had a major impact on rejiggering basically the search process to prioritize the DSO finding exactly the resource that was on that student's syllabus. Also, that user interface also streamlines the process of depositing the remediated resource. One important thing was that we wanted to make that not too hard for the DSOs. These people are really overburdened. And so there are a lot of tools in that UX to streamline how they can do it. For example, there's a bibliographic lookup where it'll fill in all the bibliographic metadata automatically for them so that they don't have to bother doing that. And then they can either upload remediated files one by one or in batches. Oftentimes the latter is preferred because they're so busy that they wait till the end of the semester and then they put them all in at the end of a semester or the end of an academic year. And one really critical thing that the DSOs do is to ensure that the files only go to qualified recipients. That's key for this to work because, publishers would be completely in opposition to this if those files could go to somebody that, that could get out into the world basically and get pirated. So the DSOs are very disciplined on ensuring that only people that are absolutely qualified to receive these get them. One thing we learned, one thing that I learned in this is that thanks to Bookshare, they've been doing this for years and they've sent out millions of files and they watermark all those things and they can track who gets them and when they're sent to somebody else. They have had literally, I think, a handful, maybe 10, not 20 instances of something going astray in all the years they've given out all these millions of files. And why is that? It's because these people really value getting these accessible resources and they do not want to break the rules. They really behave properly. So as a repository, it contains all the remediated resources. It was built on the Bookshare technology stack, but by the developers at UEA. I mentioned already that the metadata is very extensive, but very flexible so that there's a minimum of property is required to deposit something, but lots of options so that helps them find the resources they want. And then, of course, that repository is designed to always be increasing in size because new remediated content is deposited all the time. We are now at the end. We're just wrapping up the pilot phase and moving into the next phase, which I'll get to on my next slide. But we are transitioning now away from Bookshare and HathiTrust. The reason for that is they're membership organizations, so they cannot, in fact, permit remediated resources to be deposited in Emma. They have to be deposited back to Bookshare or back to HathiTrust because of their business requirements and their contractual requirements with their constituencies. So we are moving to OpenAlex and UnPaywall. And one other thing that gives us is access to lots and lots of journal literature. The pilot phase was specifically book focused, but probably more than half of the resources that DSOs remediate are journal articles. So now we're covering both. Very quickly, the metadata model has wealth of identifiers, a good selection of bibliographic metadata that helps you identify a particular resource, administrative metadata that keeps track of who did what, when, and when, and then remediation metadata, which is so key because there was no such metadata model that anybody could find for, what does a DSO need to know about a resource? Are there tables in this thing? Are there equations in this thing? Is the text just OCR, or is it the actual publisher's text in the first place? What remediation has been done on it, et cetera, et cetera. So that is now becoming an ISO standard. We've gone through the application process. We've got the approval. We are now to the point of forming the working group that's going to be working on standardizing that. It will not be identical to the Emma model because that's got a lot of very Emma specific things in it. And very quickly at the end, I'll mention the fact that we're transitioning to a membership organization with staggered annual fees so that a small organization or university pays very minimal amount and gradually bigger organizations pay bigger amount. But in every case, it's designed to be much less than the cost of remediating things that they no longer have to remediate because they can get the remediated file out of Emma. There's a small staff at UVA in the library that supports this. The infrastructure is being consolidated at UVA, and currently a lot of it was still with Bookshare. All that is now moving to UVA, and as I mentioned, including journals and cooperating with OpenAlex and UnPaywall, which brings 48 million open access journal articles easily available and findable by this search. And I'm running out of time here, so I'll just mention that there's also an educational program, a grad level curriculum. It's been actually taught at Illinois and Wisconsin, 2 different formats, one an 8-week curriculum and one a 16-week. Just background on disability, explain what DSOs do to libraries and explain what libraries do to DSOs, how to use the metadata, how to document and file formats, automated techniques to use for remediation, what the legal frameworks are, and actually providing some academic research opportunities. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. And thank you everyone for attending. This concludes our recorded presentation. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have questions or just want to continue the conversation. So thank you again.